Greetings, everyone. Glad to see you today, and welcome to our panel on restoring nature, why and how. My name is Jalonne White-Newsome, and I'm calling from southeastern Michigan on the original lands of the Potawatomi here, and so grateful to be talking with you about a very, very important topic. As of this year in February, I started my own consulting practice to work on these issues and others, with the focus of centering people and solutions that could bring us equitable health, safe, and climate. And so what I'd like you to do is think about this past year and how nature has maybe influenced how you've managed COVID and other crises. I tell you one thing, that I definitely don't take nature for granted. In fact, just being outside can be healing. It can change your mood. In fact, it's free therapy for many people. And like we'll talk about today, it also offers opportunities for communities to be a part of things that can actually mitigate the impacts of climate change and other things and threats to our communities. So with that, I'm honored to introduce our speakers for today that will share some of their personal connections to nature, talk a little bit about some examples as to how they're working to restore nature in their own communities. And again, to that question, why this is so important. So I encourage you to read the bios of our speakers on the website, because we don't have time to talk about all the great things that they're doing. So my introductions will be brief. And after that, the speakers will present, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So we hope that you will use the chat function and share your questions and comments, and we'll have a good conversation. So I'd like to first introduce Mr. Thomas Minney, who is representing external affairs and strategic initiatives in West Virginia for the Nature Conservancy. So Thomas, can you give a wave to our folks? Thank you. And then Honorable Mayor Jim Strickland of Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you, good to have you. And then last but certainly not least is Francesca, who is an oceans advocate, dive instructor, and competitive free diver. So glad to have you, Francesca. So with that, Thomas, can you kick us off?
Sure. So the theme of the program today is restoration. So I wanted to talk a bit about what the Nature Conservancy is doing. And many of you might think of the Nature Conservancy as a big environmental organization. We're going to talk only about planting trees or doing restoration of forests, but we are going to talk about that. But I want to start off by emphasizing, when we think about the restoration in West Virginia, we think of this as both a natural world process of putting back what we see in these beautiful places behind me, but also a major investment for the communities in West Virginia, because the engagement around restoration can create a restoration economy in a place that sorely needs this. So getting into the nitty-gritty of what we've been doing here in West Virginia, you can see in the picture behind me, we have very great natural resources in West Virginia. And many people were attracted here to take advantage of these natural resources. So the big swaths of forest here in West Virginia that cover the landscape were highly impacted. So our story of restoration has begun over 100 years ago, as we think about the big cuts and the large timber deals and projects were done, the large-scale mining that many people know that happened in the Appalachians. And so over the past 100 years, we've seen this regeneration, both natural regeneration, but also the efforts that people have put into the landscape to make sure that the scene that's behind me here at our Bear Rocks Preserve in Tucker County, West Virginia, is a large, intact, functional forest that provides all those ecological services like clean air and fresh water for people, and make sure it remains one of the most highly biodiverse places in North America, not only the globe. And importantly, these forests are sequestering carbon on a scale of almost to the level of the Amazon and some of the Congo forests. So this is a really important place. Specifically, what we're doing here in West Virginia as the Nature Conservancy, we're engaging heavily in a couple of pillars. One is we're working on large-scale forest restoration and forest protection for two reasons. One is to get at the ecological services that we talked about, clean water, fresh air. These forests are the lungs and the drivers for that. The other thing that we're doing is, many people, as I've mentioned, is that many places have been impacted by surface mining in West Virginia as we supplied coal to power the nation. And so those areas are now ripe for restoration. We have about 400,000 acres in the Appalachians of open mine lands of restoration. And so those are the two areas that we're going really deep on, trying to determine how we balance nature and the economy together to create new opportunities. You know, when we think about West Virginia, we have to think about the fact that we're at an inflection point in West Virginia. So we do have this big nature. It's intact. It's functioning. It provides, you know, sustenance for our souls, but also sustenance for our bodies and our well-being. And at the same time, we're at an inflection point where our economy is changing. The Appalachians have been highly impacted by the changes in the energy economies as we transition from a high carbon to a low carbon future here in the United States. So communities that are living in these wonderful places are also being impacted because there's a transition in the jobs market in West Virginia. So we've been trying to create a dialogue around restoration as not just something that's good for nature, but something that's good for people, and trying to unconstruct this dichotomy that where people think that nature and economy have to be two opposite sides of things, right? So if you think about the opportunities in West Virginia right now, we have a large labor force that was working in outdoor activities in mining or in shale gas, and this labor force is seeing less jobs. At the same time, we've got 400,000 acres of mine lands that need to be restored across the Appalachians. And those mine lands could be planted in trees, which help create timber products, or they create carbon. Or importantly, we're also focusing on creating solar on mined lands, where we can see a way that a place like West Virginia, which is an energy state, can better participate in a low carbon future. So these are the type of focus arenas that we're trying to create in West Virginia. So in addition to putting the people on the ground, planting the trees and protecting the acres through conservation projects, you know, we're also working on policy and legislation to make it the energy breadbasket for West Virginia even larger, to include such things as solar on mine lands through policy approaches in West Virginia. So we're trying to take this nature and economy dichotomy and bring it together, because, you know, we want to make sure that the health of the economy and the health of nature can be tied as we plan for the future. Because West Virginia is an amazing place in terms of what we have here in nature and the access out the back door to nature. What we need to make sure is that our communities can also thrive in this setting through the right types of jobs on the landscape, and making sure that as we create the low carbon future, that we create opportunities for these skilled workers that are already here in West Virginia to participate in that. And we are at an inflection point with the changing administrations that have just happened. You know, there are many, many discussions that are starting to take place to think about how do you take Appalachian communities that were so dependent on fossil fuels and put them into the low carbon future going forward. Because that's the way that you get communities here to want to participate, is show the opportunity and make those going forward. So that's how what we've been working on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thomas. Mayor Strickland.
Thank you, Dr. White-Newsome. First, I want to say to the folks watching, I know I'm the least qualified on this screen, and maybe the least qualified to talk about this topic that you've heard today, but maybe by giving a mayor's perspective and someone who's not educated as an environmentalist or anything like that, but someone interested in that, maybe that's a unique perspective that'll help a little bit. But first, I want to say that I'm appearing with you today not only as the mayor of Memphis, but also as the Tennessee State Chair for the Mississippi Rivers Cities and Towns Initiative, MRCTI. And that is a group of 100 United States mayors of both parties along the entire length of the Mississippi River through 10 states. Now, restoring nature for my city and the cities along the Mississippi River is motivated in part by the co-benefits and services that natural infrastructure can provide our region over built infrastructure. As mayors along the Mississippi River, we are collectively convinced that deploying natural infrastructure, such as wetlands, marshes, forest, riparian borders, and connected floodplain, protects our cities from disasters, cleans our water, attracts tourism, improves the quality of life, and sequesters carbon. Natural infrastructure also happens to be the only option that all cities can afford at scale, since we don't have to maintain it or rebuild it after storm events. Just as a sample of some of the things we've accomplished recently as a group of mayors around financing natural restoration include $300 million for Section 319 water pollution grants to secure our water supply, $300 million for pre-disaster mitigation to protect our economy and jobs. We wrote and proposed the Resilience Resolving Loan Fund Act, which was enacted January 1, 2021. We secured a landmark agreement with 3 federal agencies on water quality monitoring of the Mississippi River, which involves river cruise vessels carrying water sensors. We partnered with TNC to pass a lower Mississippi River habitat assessment to restore natural infrastructure vital to resilience. And we've deployed 2 environmental impact bonds in the region to restore natural infrastructure. Just a month or 2 ago, on March 4th, our mayor signed what we think is an historic and innovative agreement with Ducks Unlimited. Adam Putman, who's the CEO of Ducks Unlimited, and I signed a memorandum of common purpose to deploy natural infrastructure assets, such as wetlands and marshes, throughout the Mississippi River corridor to provide both habitat and disaster protection for our cities. As part of this agreement, we will first embark on an initial pilot project to deploy natural infrastructure in 3 locations, one in the upper, one in the middle, and one in the lower regions of the river valley. If this pilot is successful, we'll bring more projects online as our capacity allows. Areas that are most likely to be selected for the pilot are those subject to repetitive loss that are good for waterfowl and whose scale is achievable in the near term. We also believe that this effort can add to President Biden's 30 by 30 plan to conserve 30% of the nation's land by 2030, as well as provide additional capacity to sequester carbon through the infrastructure we restore and or install. So, thank you.
I think you are supposed to be on this panel. Thank you. Awesome, awesome. All right, Francesca.
Thank you, Dr. White-Newsome. And I think that the Honorable Mayor is sandbagging. He's actually doing the most. Oh, good day. Buenas tardes, Kalispera. Everyone's joining us from all around the world, many time zones, so I greet you all. I am Francesca Coe, and I hail from San Francisco, California. And although I am super motivated and interested in conserving nature, I have to confess that I am an accidental advocate. I grew up in New York City. I then moved to Los Angeles. I am colossally urbane. But I have to say that I actually found myself, I found my purpose, and I found my family in the ocean and in nature. And what I'd like to do is share a couple of slides to direct the conversation, because we're here to talk about restoring nature. And we need to understand that we as humans are both the question and the answer. So the question of why should we conserve nature and restore nature? The wonderful people. And how do we conserve nature? The wonderful people. And that comes in many forms. It comes in individuals like Cynthia Catton, who is a oceanographic scientist who I met on a kelp recovery project for the Sonoma and Mendocino coasts in Northern California. She single-handedly spearheaded an amalgamation of people to get us on task to restore kelp forests. She's now doing the same work up in Washington State, but one individual. And then there are the partnerships, the many different people from academic institutions, the tribes, the indigenous people, the residents, the scientists, the resource agency managers, all of these people together. This is a picture at the Bodega Marine Lab, where we all serve as stakeholders on the National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council. And it takes us doing it together. The next picture is collective activism. Young people, old people, doing fun things. If we want more people to be involved, we need to speak to them. We need to make it something they want to participate in. And then last but not least, there's a global community. So while we're all facing very specific challenges locally, the good news, bad news is everyone around the world is actually facing many of the same challenges. I like to focus on the good news in that we can come up with best practices and share with each other the things that we've learned. So then the next question is, well, how do you effectively engage all of these communities, all these beautiful faces into work and into a spirited team that goes forward together? Well, the first thing I believe is that you have to build trust. When I mentioned our kelp recovery work, we had an army of ab divers and spear fishermen and other recreational divers that were chomping at the bit to get involved because many of the fisheries and many of the activities that they liked were closed. And they said, how can we help? And we said, well, we need people to come and remove the purple urchin. And they said, sign us up. So in conjunction with the Watermen's Alliance, we had all these people that maybe otherwise we wouldn't be on the same page, but we were all on the same page. And the way we built the trust was we said, don't trust us. We said, we trust you. Help us get the work done. The next point I'd like to make is that we need to welcome everyone. It needs to be inclusive. The recreational activities, the policy decisions, they need to be informed by all the communities, all the stakeholders. And we need to make sure that people understand that these are resources. Nature is for everyone. So we need to bring everyone to the table. And especially for voices that have not been heard as frequently or heard as loudly, we need to make that space. And then the next slide, meet people where they are. So about 13 years ago, Dan Jacobson from Environment America, Kate Wing, and myself from NRDC at the time, we started something called Oceans Day in Sacramento. And we would go up and speak with everyone, all parties, all offices, all representatives. And the way that we would start a conversation is we would say, well, what's happening in your district? This particular gentleman was from an inland Central Valley district, not a coastal district. And we ended up having great dialogue and common ground because I started where he was. I need to know what his concerns are. What are his constituents dealing with? So to build upon that. And then this is a photo of students at the Scripps Oceanography Master's Program. And sometimes we think, oh, everybody knows everything. Well, no, everybody doesn't know everything. And we need to make sure we provide understanding and parameters. You know, give people additional resources, ask them what they do know, where they've heard it, where they can get more data, and to share their data, because you just never know. It's a two-way valve. It's not a one-way valve. And then this is my favorite, which is shared experiences. We can recruit more stewards when we've bonded over something, and it could be an adventure, it could be a class, and quite frankly, as we're all living through COVID, it could be a crisis. And when we harness those rapports and that camaraderie, that will take us into the future, and we will be able to go back to that well, metaphorically speaking, time and again. And so my last slide is about inspiration and teamwork, because that is what I have found to be the most successful formula. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were doing the urchin removal at Ocean Cove and Sonoma Coast, you can see the grassroots kayak fishermen. They came and they brought all their gear and they volunteered their time. And then the picture on the right is a young woman named Marcy Groundinch. And Marcy used to do coalition building with fishermen when we were starting the Marine Life Protection Act. And now, 15 years later, she's running the first ocean conservation nonprofit focused on Latino communities. It's called azul.org. So planting these seeds have such important benefits. And then, of course, my own inspiration, Dr. Sylvia Earle. And I was just on one of these new social audio platforms with her, Clubhouse, and people were asking her, what can we do? What can we do to conserve the ocean? And she wisely said, look in the mirror. What you can do is different than what anyone else can do. You have your own gifts. You have your own voice. You will know what that answer is. And then the future generations. We had people at some of those volunteer events that were as young as 3 years old. So it's never too early to get involved. And then finally, I want to end on this photo. The photo that I had at the beginning of the presentation was a picture of me with some young fishermen in Sri Lanka in a town called Madiha, which is south of Colombo. It's in the southeast corner of Sri Lanka. And I went there to do tsunami relief work. And I also went because a bunch of us were like, oh, you know, the reefs have been devastated and then they're destroying them, they're stepping on them, they're doing all these things. And then we got there and we realized that they needed help. They didn't need us to be preaching conservation at them. And so one of the things we did was we trained them to be safe, certified scuba divers from open water up to dive master so that they could have another livelihood. But in that process, you know, none of the dive curriculum, the physics, the physiology, the environmental stuff, none of that comes in Sinhalese. It's in English, Spanish, French, but not Sinhalese. So this young man on the photo on the right, I recruited, his name was Turney Pradeep, and Turney was getting his advanced degree at the University of Rahuna. And he needed to have several dive certifications and licenses to complete his studies. And I said, Turney, if you help me with translations, if you help me when we're doing lectures in case someone doesn't understand, I'm like, I will not only provide your instruction for free and your licenses for free, we'll be giving back to your community. And I just want to end on that young student all those years ago, 15 years ago, is now the general manager of the Sri Lankan Marine Environmental Protection Authority. So just remember, everyone you talk to, everything you can do in a positive way will have long-lasting effects. And so for me, restoring nature is not just about the beauty of wilderness, but the beauty of humans.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Francesca. Beautiful, beautiful. And I think what's interesting, you all centered, you know, people in all of your responses, whether it was people in the economy, people in protection, and again, people in partnerships. And so I want to jump to the mayor first, because I know we're going to lose you in a little bit. And really, can you talk about what brought these 100 or so mayors together to actually begin to think about how you can use nature as a solution? What was the impetus? What was the driver? Because I'm sure we have folks that are listening in that are like, how do I convince my electeds and my leaders that, you know, maybe this uncommon solution of using nature to solve our problems is a little bit better than gray infrastructure or other things that more engineered and calculated. Can you share with us some reflections on that?
Sure. What brought us together was the river itself. And up and down the river, we use the river for different things. The north part of the country, they use the river in part for drinking water. We don't do that in Memphis. We have an underground aquifer where we get our water from. Down here, it's a lot of commerce and recreation. The river is very different in different parts of the country. But what united us was, how do we protect and preserve the river itself? Because it is the key, not only to our individual cities, we think it's the key to the whole central part of the United States. Mm-hmm. So much commerce is done up and down the Mississippi River from Minnesota all the way down to New Orleans. And there was no one group looking at protecting that river. So that's what brought us together at the beginning. And then we started thinking, now that we're together and we're trying to lobby Congress to pay attention to the river, we think of concrete roads as infrastructure, which we should, but the river itself is infrastructure that was not getting the attention that the concrete roads were. So we brought a lot of attention to that, and then how do we come together also to build off of that river? Because like Memphis, we do not flood from the Mississippi River. We are built up on a bluff, which is, if you've ever heard Memphis called the Bluff City, that's why but we have a river off the Mississippi River called the Wolf River, and that floods. And that's what, and Ducks Unlimited is based here in Memphis. And it's that confluence of events that really came up with our partnership with Ducks Unlimited, and that would help cities up and down the river.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Thomas, I think it's really interesting, you talked about the kind of the inflection point and the transition that West Virginia is going through. And my stepdad is from West Virginia, and I love it. It's beautiful. And, but that's a major transition. And, I'm just wondering, like, how is TNC, and maybe even beyond TNC in your personal pursuits, how are you kind of working to end that dichotomy that you talked about? Because it's often people or profit or this or that. Can you share with us maybe some advice as because you're in the thick of it, that would be helpful to the folks that are listening?
Sure. And I would just stick with the theme of opportunity. We have to be able to paint the future as an opportunity as opposed to a loss to the past, right? So as we think about a low carbon future, that can sound confrontational to some people here in West Virginia because of the industries they've worked in. So the question becomes then, how do you get nature and the amenities that we have to be able to actually offer up the opportunities? And they're here. We've actually taken advantage of them. Timber has been a big industry in West Virginia for a long time. Carbon now is the new portion of the timber industry that can bring additional revenues. But how do you get people to see those markets? How do you get people to see how they can participate in that? And as well as renewable energy. When we mentioned the solar on mined lands. That's a big opportunity for people that are already skilled and being able to use heavy machinery or construction and other things to be able to think about moving to a sector that may offer a new revenue source for West Virginia. And all of that is scalable. Forest carbon can be at the big scale for major industries, as many people think about the trading markets, and it can be at the small scale as we're trying to put together with various groups like the American Forest Foundation, the Family Forest Carbon Program, to bring those dollars right down to the level of the individual farmer woodlot owner in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Francesca, I think what you shared was so beautiful, kind of this ownership of taking care of nature from all these different levels, individual, community, and partnerships. But again, one of the things that struck me is, the access to nature. And I would love for you to just maybe, share with us, what are some of maybe the equity issues that you've seen, through your work professionally or personally, where access to nature is limited? And I mean, you spoke to this a little bit, but what are some ways that we need to think about just making sure that everybody has access to nature and is able to benefit from it and address inequities that are there, either systemic or other, institutional issues that keep that from happening?
Sure, absolutely. So a couple of things. First, in California, aside from COVID, we've had really horrible fires and all kinds of natural disasters and a lot of air quality issues. And, people needed to go to the coast, both to restore their mental health, but also their physical health. And we have a long way to go before everyone who is in our backyard, so to speak, understands that these parks, that these beaches, that these locations are theirs, right? They've been held in sort of stewardship for all of the public. And so when we're talking about allocating resources at a state and federal level to ensure that the public has that access, so that there are rangers and that there are kiosks and that there are buses and there are ways for people to get there, it's not just, oh, do they know where it is? It's like, have we provided the social infrastructure to allow folks to be there is the first thing. And then the second thing is that I think we need to lift voices and stories. People need to see themselves in the outdoors. No offense, but if it's all Patagonia ads with, older white people, then it doesn't make any sense. And there are a lot of wonderful people from all different communities that are doing the work, the academic work, the science work, the adventure work, and so we have to celebrate those stories so that the kids and the generations, inner city or other, just even suburban, they realize not only is that an opportunity for fun, but it's also an opportunity as a career path, that there are ways for them to get involved. And so we have to do, when I say we, I mean the universal we, have to do a better job at both creating more resources for that, highlighting the many fantastic folks that are already doing that work, and then getting out there and inviting people. Because I have to say, from a personal point of view, I have gotten no richer sustenance, no more spiritual faith than being in the ocean and being outdoors. And I feel so fortunate. I want everyone to feel the way that I feel. And that's our job, to ensure that those resources become available for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. And Mayor Strickland, we have one question for you, hopefully that you can hit in the next 2 minutes. Have you considered bringing your language of the river as a natural road as a concept to consider in President Biden's infrastructure bill? Uh-oh, we can't hear you.
You must have been in our mayor's meetings, because that's exactly what we've done. We have talked to White House representatives. We've talked to congressional leadership of both parties. We are trying to make our way into the discussion, saying, hey, don't forget us in the middle of the country. This river is important, and we're getting a very good response. So we feel optimistic about the future. And, it just shows you, if we all come together from diverse backgrounds with one thing and with a common goal, we can make a difference. And I think hopefully you'll see some results from that soon.
Awesome.
I do have to get off, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you great folks. Thank you.
We appreciate you being here. All right. Well, Thomas and Francesca, so there's a couple questions that came in. And so maybe, Thomas, you can kick us off. So I've spent a lot of my work working on health equity, particularly around climate change and environmental justice. And, as we talk about nature, can you share some of maybe restoration initiatives in particular that you've worked on that have had a focus on health, improving health and health equity? Is there anything that comes to mind that you could share, either Thomas or Francesca?
Yeah, I think I thought about this question a lot, being with the Nature Conservancy, and what I would say is, I think I would define there are multiple levels of health that we're talking about, right? And I think Francesca mentioned this earlier. There's the actual physical corporal health, there's the mental health, and there's sort of family and community health. And I usually sit in this space of where I'm thinking of what's the community health, or what's the access to nature that's affecting a mentality. And I can say that every project that I've ever done for the Nature Conservancy has that element in it, because it's either making space available for the public that's going to be able to get out there and convene with nature more. And I can put that in a context that we're thinking about that for the folks that are driving out from DC 3 hours away to come to West Virginia to escape the impacts of sitting in an apartment during COVID, right? Or coming to West Virginia for those benefits of getting out into nature. And so what we've done on conservation is benefiting even inner city people coming out here. And then if I think about that in the local context, one of the great things about being a West Virginian is you grow up connected to the land. I mean, you walk out your back door as a kid and you're going to be playing in nature most of the time here, right? So every action that we take on conservation ensures that that connection, which is a link to building family, which is a link to building the way you think about life, and which is a link to the way that you think about what your place is in the world, gets maintained. Oh, and that's a continuity that many of our communities here in West Virginia want to see and want to feel. It's a part of who they are and their families. And it's an asset that we'd like to maintain, even as we think about what's the new for us going forward. You know, I think I haven't spent a lot of time personally measuring the quantifiable difference on the health factors of what we do. I'm sure we could do that, but I wouldn't try to answer that right now. So.
Not a problem. Not a problem. And some of those aren't quantifiable. It may be more qualitative. So that's great data as well.
Yeah, we create more fresh water and more fresh air. That's quantifiable, but how that translates, especially into corporal health, I can't give you that right now. So.
Yes.
Yeah. And as the ocean advocate, let me underscore both in terms of fresh water and the air we breathe. There's no bigger ecosystem service provider than the ocean. And when it comes to carbon sequestration and mitigation, there's nobody absorbing more carbon than the ocean. Locally in California, I volunteer with an organization called the Greater Farallones Association, and they run a variety of different education programs. It's sort of the nonprofit arm of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. And two of their programs, one is called Beach Watch, where people have been for decades going out and walking the beaches and collecting data about what they see, what's on the beach, marine life, birds, garbage, et cetera, so that there is a rich and consistent database of information of when there is or isn't, for example, an oil spill or some other degradation event. Now, that is fantastic in and of itself. But when I tell you that there is a waiting line for people to go out and do this work, which is really work, the mental health and the enjoyment that they're getting is fantastic. And for the students, obviously with COVID, it has been a challenge, but there's a program called Limpets. And I always get the acronym wrong. So let me just double check my notes. Long-term monitoring program and experiential training for students. And what the Greater Farallones Association was able to do actually was, instead of going into the field with the students and going into the classrooms, they were able to transition to virtual conferencing, virtual events, virtual training. And they were actually able to touch more students and provide a richer experience for a wider swath of inner city and urban kids who normally wouldn't have been able to participate. So there was a silver lining there. And I think that when people have an opportunity to look forward to something, especially something when they know that their hand has a role in a solution or making something better, there are so many beneficial, uplifting effects from that, and feeling a part of a larger community and knowing that you made a difference.
Awesome, Francesca. So I'm wondering, as in Francesca, this kind of came out, I think, in your sharing earlier about just the importance of kind of partnerships and having conversation and building trust, and again, all these good things to kind of bring different people into this space that may not feel like they see themselves. And so, as a part of that, I would love both of you to kind of respond to this. In your conservation work, how are you bringing in, or how do you maybe aspire to bring in Indigenous knowledge, particularly on the scientific aspects of conservation? Is that something that you all have done or are working on, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Boy, I feel like you're just teeing up every question I want you to ask.
I'm glad.
Well, selfishly, going back to kelp, I am the kelp princess on Instagram. The kelp recovery work project that we started because of the vision of Cynthia Catton and then the support of Maria Brown from the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. the very first assignment for me as a co-chair of that work group was to make sure that we had the Indigenous knowledge and the different bands, the Pomo bands, and all the other local folks who have been stewards of this land for centuries, for millennia. And so one of the most important things for us was getting the benefit of that sort of understanding, that cultural understanding that none of us have even a smidgen of a fraction of what they understand. And the one thing that I'll highlight in the work that we did, aside from including them and making sure they're at the table and making sure that they were part of the architecture, should we do it this way or that way, not going to them, don't go to them after with a plan. They should be the architects along with you or whomever else. One of the things that we face as people who care about preservation and conservation, we always have messaging issues. And people nowadays, especially, they're always looking for a villain. Whose fault is it? Who do we blame? And one of the most profound and important things that we garnered from Javier Garcia, who was our Indigenous representative, was as we were thinking about how do we save the kelp, and everyone was like, the urchin are the bad ones. The urchins are the bad ones. Javier was like, no, the urchin are another natural resource that actually could provide benefits. So let's not make them the villain. Let's recognize their importance in this whole connective ecosystem. So those kinds of things to me are immeasurable and invaluable, and they come from that rich history.
Awesome. Thank you. Thomas, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that the Nature Conservancy has been known for is it being a convener. And here in the Appalachians, that's what we did in West Virginia. As we set out on this quest a few years ago to really figure out this nature and economy space, the first thing we thought we needed to do was listen. And so we created a series of nature and economy roundtables, and we had everybody from coal executives to local community members that participated in these things. And we brought a lot of local knowledge because many of my staff are going home at night to either coal communities, or they see their family in coal communities, or I grew up in natural gas country in West Virginia, and at the same time, I'm working in conservation. So we've got multiple layers where we're trying to bring in both organized venues where we have people sit together and kind of look at what the vision could be. Are these the right places to be testing around mineland restoration? Are these the right places to be testing around natural climate solutions like forest carbon? And those resonated, so we continued forward. And then I have to sit down at a table with my extended family in West Virginia and explain to them what I'm doing, and getting those voices from my family, from the community, and others to really test and push me to make sure that we're getting the right voices and the right attitudes included in the work that we do going forward.
Thank you so much. I appreciate both of you all being so thoughtful and intentional in listening and the important things about building trust and community to get any of this done. And so in our last minute or so, I would love for you to maybe impart two things on our audience. One, what continues to give you hope as you work at this intersection of conservation and nature and health and equity? What gives you hope? And then maybe one piece of advice. So, Francesca, would you like to start?
Sure. I guess what gives me hope is that I just recently got back from Baja, and I was there spearfishing, and I've never seen so many juvenile yellowtails. So I couldn't believe the number of young fish, which is obviously a sign of a healthy system and productivity. So when I see the resurgence of species, that really gives me hope. And I also think that the fact that people are starting to pay attention in ways that they weren't before, and I mean that in terms of decision makers and officials, but I also think what this pandemic has shown us is just how important nature is and how important it is for people to have access. And so I think that's at the forefront in a way that wouldn't have been previously. So that all gives me hope.
Awesome. Thank you. Thomas.
I think the word for me is resiliency. The scene behind me looks like a pristine forest, but 100 years ago, it was burned to the ground. And nature has restored itself, and it's functioning in a way that gives us sustenance, but also feeds our souls right there behind me. So as we look forward, we have to keep in mind that nature is very resilient if we take care of it and try to do the restoration work that we have. And what gives me hope is that people are hungry for these conversations of how do you bring this together? How do you make this future that allows us to have this plus thriving jobs and thriving livelihoods and well-being all at the same time? I think people are very hungry for that conversation going forward. And that gives me not only hope, but a lot of optimism that the voices will come together if we can just keep talking to one another.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so much, Francesca, Thomas, and Mayor Strickland, for being here and being a part and sharing your wisdom and your voices. And again, to the audience, I hope everyone continues to be safe and well, and think about what you've heard here and how you can actually activate that in your community. So take care.